you to this session, which is really a promising session that comes out for our own previous will and project of recognizing and awarding our young talents. And we do have many of them, so we'll have to move quicker to reach them. So we started with our first awardee, that was Ilana Horowitz, that is today with us. And now we are with our second awardee, Matt Bokser, that we really are happy to have him with us. The session today is called What is Zionism? Assessing the diversity of discourse in a church environment. And we do agree that is a church environment. I would like to share with you a brief comment on that while today Israel and the Jewish people, we are facing crucial dilemmas derived and strengthened today because of war conditions, without ignoring the ever-changing dynamics of political, social, cultural movements and unexpected challenges, Zionism as a project, as a reality, was and is part of a broad transnational process of the making of modern and contemporary Jewish history. A project concerning territorial sovereignty and the Jewish people in the diaspora. Although modernity implied that Judaism be subject to a tense fluctuation between the recognition of its otherness and its denial, a predicament against which it generated, as we know, conceptual and ideological responses, the conditions we are today of a radical modernity confront Judaism with the challenge of reconciling its specificity with the common substrates of universality in a new and by no means tense dynamics between the affirmation of difference and the historical struggle for equality, derived from the multiple challenges of radical modernity and the cultural and the ideological effervescence we are in, the transformation of Jewish geography that continue to take place, and the national, regional, and global dynamics affirm the most diverse dimension of responses, ideologies, political practices, and our will of scientific responses. So it is for me really a pleasure to have today the possibility to present a long-lasting research that our awardee, Matt Bokser, carried regarding precisely this challenge of diversity, of the pluralization of discourse, and also of theories and narratives, and will enlighten us with his research. We have today invited, following Matt's suggestion, two discussants, Professor Len Saxe, the director of the known Center for Research at Brandeis, and we also have Dr. Mijal Bitton, has today visiting professor at NYU, right? So without any more formal presentation, and having appreciate your, I would say, your attention to this introductory reflection that emphasize that diversity, ambivalences, ambiguities, but also strong projects have defined the root of Zionism. So Matt, you are more than welcome then to start your conference today.
Thank you, Judit. Let me start sharing my screen.
Yes.
And let's see, with any luck, you should now be able to see a PowerPoint slide deck. Just trying to make sure that I can see the PowerPoint slide deck. There we go. So thank you, Judit, for that introduction. And of course, thank you to the ASSJ for the Distinguished Early Career Award that precipitated this event, and Judit and Elizabeth for organizing the webinar. I am very happy to share with all of you today just a small piece of a study that I've been working on in my spare time for the last 2 years. And I'm very excited to hear what Len and Mijal will have to say in response. Before we get into it, though, I feel like I should give something of a trigger warning. This is, as I said, a small part of a study to understand the full range and scope of North American Jews' perspectives on Israel. The person who did most of the initial coding on the data I'm focusing on primarily today, Adina Ben-Kirkarp, who I see just joined the call, she described these data as explosive, which is usually exciting to hear when you're looking for interesting research findings to present, but not a word you ever want to hear when discussing Israel, especially under the present circumstances. One of the most difficult parts of doing research like this is that no matter your own views on Israel, Palestine, the conflict writ large, or the current war, if you dig into these data, you're going to find a lot of responses that infuriate you, either because this is a topic about which many of us are very passionate and the respondents vehemently disagree with some or all of our views, or because some of them are relying on what might charitably be called alternative facts. I'm trying to assess the breadth of Jewish opinion about Israel, whatever it is, wherever it comes from, and however well or ill-informed it may be. Accordingly, it doesn't matter if some of the responses are objectively wrong or offensive, or if you or I would spend a lifetime opposing them in every way we can. It only matters that these opinions exist, some in large numbers, some not so large. But if you want to understand the full range and scope of Jewish opinion about Israel, you can't afford to bury your head in the proverbial sand. So I'm asking you not to focus on whether you share the views you're about to hear or whether they're supported or opposed by objective facts. Focus instead on the reality that these views exist, where they might have come from, and what their implications are for discourse about Israel, both in the Jewish community and more broadly. How you define Zionism may depend on any number of factors, including your religion, your politics, your age, your audience, your nationality, and your assessment of how much complexity you can afford in any given discussion, and other factors. And are we talking about political Zionism, cultural Zionism, labor Zionism, revisionist Zionism, religious Zionism, checkbook Zionism, which I think people might be more familiar with as philanthropic Zionism, but it's a little bit of a shout out to a former office mate of mine who just has a new book out. And there are other varieties of Zionism as well. If Zionism is the national movement of the Jewish people, and as is often attributed to David Ben-Gurion, where there are two Jews, there are three opinions, then there must be more definitions of Zionism than there are Jews. And that's before you get to people who aren't Jewish, but are Zionists. Now, I spend most of my time working on surveys of Jewish communities around the United States. So naturally, it's very important for me to understand how the people I survey interpret the questions I'm asking them. And I started this project because I felt there might be significant variation in how certain questions about Israel were being interpreted. I started thinking about this because for several years, I've been helping journalists reporting on the Jewish community make sense of surveys about American Jews' attitudes toward Israel. It usually starts when a new survey comes out and I get a phone call or an email from someone writing about it, only they tell me that something in the findings doesn't sound quite right to them. They want to know if the problem is that they've misunderstood something, or that the report misrepresented something, or that the survey itself misrepresented something, or maybe it's something else. And frequently, the problem comes from multiple understandings of key terms, sometimes overlapping, but sometimes competing. Consider, for example, a reported finding that I suspect many of you have heard, that 95% of American Jews are Zionists. This is something that was reported frequently in the Jewish press in 2019 and 2020. And if you consume reports of survey findings like I do, you'll still see it in a news article, opinion piece, or social media post every couple of months. And if your mindset is that American Jews should be Zionists, it's a great finding, one that you want to hear that relegates the anti-Zionists to the radical fringe. There's just one problem with it. It's not true. The purported source is Frank Newport, a senior scientist at Gallup, one of the top polling organizations in the United States. But let's be clear, Newport doesn't actually say that 95% of American Jews are Zionists. Across Gallup's available data, Newport shows that 95% of American Jews, at least as of 2019, had favorable views of Israel. In fact, nowhere in anything that Newport wrote that you see on the screen or anywhere in the longer article will you find the words Zionist or Zionism. And favorable views do not necessarily equate to Zionism or Zionist identity, but that doesn't stop people from making the cognitive leap anyway. Some examples. Here are 4 activists or pundits making claims about how many American Jews support Israel. And this is based on Newport's finding about how many American Jews have favorable views about Israel. 2 of the quotes you see here appear to specifically equate support for Israel with Zionism, and if you read the longer essays, they all appear to do so. But are support for Israel and Zionism truly equivalent? We've gone from favorable to support to Zionist as if these terms were interchangeable, and I suppose they may be for some people, but I don't think they are for everyone. I will grant that the Venn diagram of American Jews who are Zionists, American Jews who support Israel, and American Jews who have favorable views about Israel has a tremendous amount of overlap, but it's not a circle. And because it's not a circle, we should not assume that these terms mean the same thing to all of the people who participate in our surveys. Still, empirical conclusions should not be drawn from gut instincts. We should look at the data and we should see if these terms are equivalent or not. And it turns out when we do that, they're really not equivalent. So Amnon Kavari and Guy Friedman, in their comprehensive review of public opinion polling of Americans' views about Israel, not just Jews, but all Americans, they provide some evidence that suggests we shouldn't think of mere support or favorable views as equivalent to Zionism. The question that Gallup routinely asks on their surveys is not about Zionism or support for Israel at all, just about favorable views. And it's asked about lots of countries, not only Israel. What is your overall opinion of this country or that? Is it very favorable, mostly unfavorable, or very unfavorable? Kavari and Friedman identified 59 high-quality surveys from Gallup and other sources that asked this question about 27 countries, including Israel. And among the 27 countries, in the aggregate across all of the surveys, Israel ranks 7th. So if favorability is to be equated with Zionism, we might need to rethink how we describe American foreign policy and ethnic and cultural affinities for Canada, the United Kingdom, Germany, Japan, France, and India, which are the 6 countries that scored higher than Israel. And maybe we should do all of that anyway. I happen to know the revised lyrics to the Canadian national anthem and about the debate to revise them again, but no one gets bent out of shape over whether or not I'm a Canadianist, and it's been a while since anyone was seriously or even unseriously concerned about dual loyalty toward Germany. We also have recent findings from 3 community studies and a few more coming, including Los Angeles and Chicago, the second and fourth largest Jewish communities in the country by Jewish Federation catchment area, and the Portland, Oregon area as well. These three communities combined are home to almost 950,000 Jews. And so based on how few Jews in these three communities alone describe themselves as Zionists, even if 100% of all Jews in every other community across the United States identified as Zionists, we still couldn't get to 95% of all American Jews. But these studies also provide some pretty good evidence that having favorable views about Israel is not the same as identifying as a Zionist. Across these three communities, we see that respondents tend to be significantly less likely to identify as Zionists than to express attitudes that are often described as Zionist across a wide variety of other items, including feeling pride in Israel's accomplishments, considering it important for Israel to be a Jewish state, and considering it important for Israel to exist as a refuge for the Jewish people. Now, you might quibble that this is mere semantics, that these really are Zionists who are unwilling or afraid to identify as Zionists on a survey for political reasons or because of fear of anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism, and some of them probably are. But it's also very unlikely that semantics alone would explain the gap between identifying as a Zionist and support for these other views. We also need to consider how much we should trust the finding attributed to Newport in the first place. In a different article cited here, he writes that across all of the surveys he's using in his analysis, he only has 128 Jewish respondents. That's just not enough for reliable estimation. It's hard to develop a truly representative sample of US Jewry with a sample this small and with methods that were designed to obtain a representative sample of Americans rather than American Jews who are not distributed across the map the same way as Americans in general and are demographically dissimilar on a number of factors. And there's ample reason to think that this sample may be biased in favor of folks who have more favorable views of Israel than average. So this finding that gets repeated over and over and over again is questionable, even if you could equate favorability with Zionism, but you can't and you shouldn't. And to be completely fair, Newport shouldn't be blamed for other people making that cognitive leap. But this finding still makes the rounds as a factoid in the mainstream press and in American Jewish discourse about Israel. And that sort of thing is why the journalists who call me are confused. They have a decent sense of the zeitgeist, and although many, if not quite all of them, accept that the American Jewish community, or at least the most Jewish communally engaged part of the American Jewish community, is very supportive of Israel and possibly even identifies as Zionist, there are also a lot of Jews out there who are less supportive or not supportive at all, or actively in opposition to the state of Israel. The 95% figure just doesn't make any sense to them, or some other newer finding doesn't make sense, so they call me to help them make sense of it. Now, I always walk them through some version of what I've just shared with you, looking at the context of the finding in question and how well it fits with other evidence. And over the years, I started asking many of these journalists, what do you think would happen if survey respondents did not all understand the questions the same way? What if at least some of the Jewish population have experienced semantic shift? That is, maybe we once had a singular definition of Zionism, perhaps even with some variation built in, but the meaning has shifted over time due to sociocultural or other factors. What if different segments of the population now have different understandings of what it means to support Israel, or to have a favorable view of Israel, or to be a Zionist? What if, for example, to one respondent, being a Zionist means unconditionally and without criticism, which is not necessarily to say uncritically supporting Israel, but to another respondent, it means vociferously opposing certain Israeli policies, much in the same way that a large share of the Israeli population has been doing for the past year, even before October 7th. Obviously, that could affect the way people answer our questions. Somebody needed to study this. Even other researchers I spoke with agreed someone needed to do this research, but no one was doing it. So I decided a couple of years ago I wanted to do some of it, if only to gain better understanding for myself. And honestly, I didn't think that this would turn into a big thing, but it kind of took off on me. And I'll show you some numbers in just a couple of minutes. So basically what I did was this. I ran a cognitive test of 4 commonly asked questions about Israel on surveys of American Jews. I had about 15 questions that I wanted to test, but you can only test so many at a time at the depth of information that I was seeking. So for anyone in our audience, not everyone here is a sociologist or a social scientist. So for anyone who's not familiar with a cognitive test, it's a tool that researchers use to assess how our questions are understood by the people we want to understand them. Most commonly, you'll get anywhere from a handful to a few dozen of your friends, family, colleagues, students, or random people you've connected with on Facebook to share their thoughts. You use their feedback to make any tweaks you think are necessary to your questionnaire. And then you go out and you start formally collecting data for whatever it is that you're trying to study, satisfied that your respondents are answering the question you intended, rather than interpreting it as though it were a completely different question. But if you're starting with the premise that you think there's wide variation in how your questions are understood, you might need to go a little bit bigger, get more than just a few dozen people to tell you what they think, and not just the people you know well. So that's the basic method here. I started with my personal contacts, but I also asked all of them to invite their contacts to answer my question. This is sometimes called snowball sampling, and it's not great if you need a representative sample, one that can stand in for the entire population you're trying to study, but it's a useful technique when you're just trying, as I was, to get a large and diverse sample. That is, as long as you're beginning with a diverse enough set of contacts that you don't only get people who are too similar to yourself. So I spend most of my time dealing with US Jews, but for reasons that basically amounted to, I know lots of Canadians and I need to get a big diverse sample of people to give me their data, I decided that I wouldn't make this just a survey of US Jews. I'd include any interested North American Jews in my sample. And here you see the 4 questions that I ended up testing. How emotionally attached are you to Israel? And 3 items with a common stem. To what extent do you agree or disagree with the following statements? First, North American Jews have the right to criticize Israel's government. Second, and the question that I'm most focusing on today, I describe myself as a Zionist. And third, Israel is an apartheid state. The attachment question is the most common survey question used to assess Jews' affinity for or connection to Israel. And it's been asked on hundreds of surveys since 1990. The others have not become very common until the last few years or so, but they do pop up frequently enough that, that I wanted to see how do people understand them. And in any event, here's how the cognitive test worked. For each of these core questions, respondents were first asked the survey question as it's been commonly asked on surveys. Then they were asked to explain in their own words why they selected the preferred response option. Next, they got 1 or 2 additional open-ended questions. For the Zionism question, I asked, what does it mean for a North American Jew to identify as a Zionist, a non-Zionist, or an anti-Zionist? And finally, in addition to these questions, I also asked a series of background questions to ensure that I really did get a diverse sample and to provide a little bit of context. So let's take a look at some of those data for a minute. Now, I recruited my respondents primarily on Twitter before Elon Musk turned it into the preferred platform for people who think Jews control the world with space lasers. But I also recruited through Facebook, LinkedIn, Mastodon, Post News, and as I've said, word of mouth. I did not reach out to any organization to ask for their help in distributing the survey, but I heard organically from representatives of about 30 organizations, ranging from small local minyanim to national organizations, and most of these sent the survey link to at least some of their people. Mostly, I just asked friends and family to help me spread the access link through their networks. And because my people are amazing, they delivered in a very big way. I ended up with 1,854 usable responses, which is a huge number for a cognitive test. I define a usable response as a North American Jew who answered at least one of the open-ended questions on the survey, because the open-ended questions were the entire point of the survey. There were nearly another 1,000 responses that I threw out because they didn't answer any of the open-ended questions, and so they weren't useful to me. This is not a representative sample, so no one should look at these data and say that X% of North American Jews feel this way or that way, but it covers a wide swath of the North American Jewish community. I have a good chunk of the Jewish anti-Zionist left. I have Kahanists, and I have a whole lot of people in between. I got a pretty good mix by gender, a good number of Jews of color, a good distribution by ages. In the table on the right, you can see I have age organized by some definitions of generations that the Pew Research Center used to use, and I guess still does use on occasion. I have at least one respondent from every US state and DC, except for Wyoming, which is personally very frustrating for me because I know Jews in Wyoming. I also have respondents from 7 Canadian provinces, Mexico, and Jamaica, and a small number of US Jews currently living in Israel, Europe, or Asia. About half of these are academics who are currently on sabbatical. My sample is quite a bit more likely to have been to Israel, both at all and for multiple visits, than at least the US Jewish population as a whole. My sample also leans a bit more liberal than even the much more liberal than the general population US Jewish community, but I had friends and colleagues with influence in right-wing Jewish circles who encouraged their people to participate as well, so I did get a decent number of conservatives. So all in all, again, not a representative sample, but at least on these measures, it's also not so far off from one either. Most importantly, it's a diverse sample, and as I mentioned, quite a bit larger than is typical for a cognitive test. And here we see the distribution of responses for the core questions. You can see that about 3/4 of my respondents say they are somewhat or very attached to Israel. Nearly 90% somewhat or strongly agree that North American Jews have the right to criticize the Israeli government. Nearly 2/3 somewhat or strongly agree that they describe themselves as Zionists, but not 95%. And 38% somewhat or strongly agree that Israel is an apartheid state, while nearly 60% somewhat or strongly disagree. So those are the quantitative data. Let's start taking a look at the qualitative data, particularly on the Zionism question. This is, after all, the point of the study. So here you see a few tables, and there's a lot of data here with most of the codes that we applied on the Zionism open-ended questions. And I realize there's a lot you might want to read on the screen, so I'm going to have a lot to say before moving on to my next slide. Coding was inductive, meaning that we didn't have any particular set of themes we were looking for a priori. We just wanted to look to see what patterns emerged across all of the responses that we had to play with. There are another 10 or so codes not shown. They're left out because they popped up less frequently than the ones that you see on the screen. And frankly, isn't this enough already? And you can see some of the codes are pretty frequent. 1,590 respondents answered at least one of the open-ended questions about Zionism. And of these, 640 said something about Zionism entailing the belief that Jews deserve self-determination in the land of their heritage or where they are indigenous. 444 said that anti-Zionism entails the belief that Israel should not exist. 142 said that anti-Zionism is equivalent to anti-Semitism. 93 said that Zionism and Judaism are equivalent, interchangeable, or inseparable, sort of recalling the quote I cited from Neusner earlier. 93 said that anti-Zionists seek equity and justice for Palestinians first and worry about Jewish history or ties to the land second. But 74 said that anti-Zionists lack any regard for Jewish history at all. 144 said that Zionism entails caring about the safety and security of the Jewish people, but 46 said that anti-Zionists are opposing apartheid or genocide imposed by Israel on the Palestinian people. And there's much more just on the screen. If you were a participant in the cognitive test, you can probably find some codes in this list that would at least somewhat decently apply to whatever you would have written. And I'm sure you can also find some that you find troubling, possibly even rage-inducing. Over the next few slides, I want to look at some of these codes and see if there are any places where Zionists and anti-Zionists agree about how to define Zionism and anti-Zionism. Now, before I explain exactly what you're looking at on this slide, a quick note. For the purposes of this presentation, anti-Zionists are defined as those respondents who said that they somewhat or strongly disagree with the statement, "I describe myself as a Zionist." This is far from a perfect definition, though there is a fair amount of support for it in these respondents' raw responses to the open-ended questions. Many of them did explicitly identify as anti-Zionists in those responses. Without adding another question to the survey, which seemed to me was already getting too long, this was the simplest way to categorize respondents quickly without adding an additional layer to an already complicated coding task. That essentially leaves us with 62% of respondents in the Zionist column, 32% in the anti-Zionist column, and I've left out the 8% who said they had no opinion or were not sure if they described themselves as Zionists. They're a messy group to analyze, though they're plenty interesting in their own right. So the data that you see here, one of the challenges of data like these is that the vast majority of respondents aren't going to share every single detail they might think or feel about Zionism and anti-Zionism. So we have to be careful not to read too much into the estimates. We shouldn't say, based on these data, for example, that 54% of Zionists and 14% of anti-Zionists in the sample feel that Zionism entails a belief that Jews deserve self-determination in Israel, the land of their heritage, or where they are indigenous, only that those are the proportions whose expressed responses warranted those codes. But we're looking for general differences in the pattern of how Zionists and anti-Zionists describe what it means to them to identify with either ideology. Here we see the 8 most used codes to describe Zionism in my data set, broken down by the proportions of Zionist and anti-Zionist respondents whose responses warranted those codes. Chi-square test showed significant differences between the groups on every one of these items, and the pattern is exactly what you would expect. Those codes that might be interpreted as positive toward Zionism were applied significantly more frequently to the responses of Zionists than to the responses of anti-Zionists, and the codes that might be interpreted as negative toward Zionism were applied significantly more frequently to the responses of anti-Zionists than to the responses of Zionists. And that's sort of expected to be tautological. Similarly, we have the 8 codes that are most commonly applied to the respondents' takes on anti-Zionism here. And on all but the last one, that anti-Zionists lack regard for Jewish history, there are significant differences between the Zionists and the anti-Zionists. And sure enough, the codes that might be deemed as favorable to anti-Zionists or from an anti-Zionist perspective were applied significantly more frequently to anti-Zionists' responses, and the codes that might be deemed unfavorable to anti-Zionists or from an anti-Zionist perspective were applied significantly more to Zionists' responses. So bringing some of the content of the last two slides together, I find this juxtaposition particularly interesting. Zionists and anti-Zionists don't agree with each other about much of anything having to do with their positions. And here we see some stark differences on Jewish ties to the land of Israel and the legitimacy of the state. It appears that there's something of a Rashomon effect here, where people understand an event or a social construct in different or even contradictory ways, reflecting not objective truth, but the limits of the information to which they are personally aware or are able to process, and their subjective and often self-interested interpretations of it. And please don't mistake me, I mean that literally, not judgmentally. The more contested the view, the greater the tendency to interpret the circumstances around it in a way that privileges one's preconceived notions. In a polarized environment such as the one we're living in, and with a topic such as this, it's not difficult to find two people who examine the same evidence, the same social phenomenon, and interpret it in diametrically opposite ways. An excellent example of this comes from one of the other questions that I tested on the extent to which respondents agreed or disagreed with a statement describing Israel as an apartheid state. Here you see responses from two respondents, one who strongly agrees that Israel is an apartheid state, and the other who strongly disagrees. When asked why they feel this way, they both wrote the exact same thing. It's obvious, no explanation is necessary. Now, these two respondents looked at the situation in Israel and the Palestinian territories and interpreted what they observed in diametrically opposite ways because they had very divergent understandings of apartheid and the extent of Palestinians' legal protections in Israel. And we know this because the follow-up question asked them to explain what they thought it means to describe a country as an apartheid state. This is an obvious example of two respondents looking at the same phenomenon, even if they don't necessarily have the same background, the same knowledge, the same personal connections, and each coming to conclusions that they believe are obvious, but are nevertheless diametrically opposing each other. As I noted at the beginning of this presentation, my goal is not to establish who is right and who is wrong, but to understand the range and diversity of views in the North American Jewish population. But I will weigh in here on one detail. If the answer is so obvious that no explanation is necessary, you'd expect respondents to come to the same conclusion, but these two didn't. So coming up to the end of my presentation, if you thought I was going to give you a definition of Zionism today or a conclusive definition, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but not that sorry. On the screen, you see some of the raw data from my respondents, direct quotes sharing their definitions of Zionism or Zionists, some positive, some negative, some more or less turned off by the entire discussion. North American Jews have vastly divergent knowledge of Israel, experiences of Israel, and personal connections to Israel, and vastly divergent external stimuli that influence their opinions. Naturally, we have vastly divergent senses about what Zionism is, and why wouldn't we? Here at Brandeis University, our dear friend, teacher, colleague, and mentor, Ilan Troen, is famous for teaching that there are multiple narratives about Israel. Why wouldn't there also be multiple narratives of Zionism? If we want to understand the full scope and diversity of North American Jewish opinion about Israel, we better have a decent grasp of more than just whichever narrative we happen to prefer. And that matters for all kinds of reasons. Among them, but not limited to them, Most of my work with Jewish communities around the country is supposed to help solve problems. One of the problems most of these communities complain about is that it's difficult to have civil conversations about Israel. We've all seen more than enough of that in the past 5.5 months, and even long before that. And I won't claim to be able to explain all of it, but it's perfectly clear to me that at least some of it comes from people shouting past each other, dismissing the thoughts and feelings of those who aren't 100% in lockstep with them as irrelevant, heretical, or even criminal. If you're a scholar, you aren't going to learn anything from someone you're calling stupid, a murderer, or a bad Jew. If you're a teacher, you can't teach anything to someone you're calling stupid, a murderer, or a bad Jew. If you're an advocate, you can't convince anyone to join you or to adopt your view if you're calling them stupid, a murderer, or a bad Jew. But you might have better luck if you take the time to understand their perspective, not agree with it, not accept it into your heart, but simply to understand it and where it comes from without needless accusations or recriminations, and speak with them calmly and with respect. And I know that's hard sometimes. I can scarcely believe that all of this needs to be said, but it does. You look at our public discourse and it does need to be said. And it doesn't have to be this way. I think of our friend and former ASSJ board member, Randy Schnoor, who has spent the past few months helping to facilitate healthier dialogue between Palestinian and Arab students and alumni at York University in Toronto and their Israeli and Jewish counterparts. I think about my friends at Colby College, whose Tzedakah Zakat Fellowship pairs Jewish and Muslim students who engage in service projects together in central Maine to make their community a better place. And in so doing, they learn to share their views and support each other on difficult issues, even when they disagree. And I am grateful, despite all the vitriol in my data, for the hundreds of survey respondents who demonstrated their willingness to engage with people who do not share their views, even those whose views they would spend a lifetime opposing. Viewed one way, my data are extraordinarily depressing. Viewed another way, they contain building blocks for a stronger Jewish community with healthier discourse about Israel, and together with the real-world impact of some of our friends and colleagues, maybe even for a more peaceful world, one I pray will emerge in the not-too-distant future. So before I turn things over to our respondents, I just want to say there are a lot of people who have helped me along the way, and I would like to thank them. Anyone you see listed here by name either provided support or labor for this study, or gave me some of their time as I was thinking about how to approach this research. Any errors or omissions in the research or from this list of names are entirely my responsibility. I also want to thank the representatives of the nearly 30 organizations, as I mentioned, some national, some local, some regional, that sent the link to the survey to part or all of their mailing lists. I won't name them, I won't name their representatives because some of them are a little bit sensitive about participating in research like this. And unfortunately, they have reason to be. This kind of research comes with an inordinate amount of hate mail. I've gotten more hate mail from conducting this study than from 20 plus years of other surveys combined. But I'm nevertheless grateful for the help of all of these people in ensuring that I would have a large and diverse sample. And of course, I have to thank the respondents who shared the survey link with their contacts as well. It's how I got from a couple hundred respondents, which is what I thought I'd end up with, to 1,854. I'm just blown away by the amount of help I was able to get from the people who participated in the study. So thank you to all of them, and thank you to all of you for being here, and I look forward to the responses. With that, I'll stop sharing my screen.
Sorry, I was mute. Thank you very much, Matt. I think that there was without even talking about it, a consonance, a convergence with my first introductory reflections and your last comments. It comes to my mind before I invite our discussants, the 3 volumes, foundational volumes by David Vital on Zionism, when he defines Zionism as the arena of of struggle and debates of the most diversified and varied protagonists, and much more that we can exchange during this session. Thank you very much. I think it's a wonderful presentation, a call to a dialogue, to listen to each other, which is an intellectual and existential call. And now, so I'll ask Professor Len Saxe, the director of Cohen Center and the former president of our association, to offer us his comments. Please, Len.
So thank you, Judit, and thank you to Matt. It's an honor to be asked to share some reactions. I do want to start by thanking Judit for organizing this webinar. It's what we need to be doing as part of our ASSJ mission. I'm particularly honored and pleased that we're featuring Matt Bokser and his work. Known him and we worked together for 2 decades. He combines deep knowledge of Judaism with equally deep knowledge of social theory and methodology, and he's able to combine them to produce distinctive work that reflects rigorous intellectual and empirical analysis that addresses important questions. So I want to try to be brief and talk about what is Zionism and what has Matt taught us, what have I learned, and what are we all learning from him. I think he made a similar comment to one of my framing remarks is that in our current polarized political environment, both sides of the ocean, Zionism has taken on a host of connotations, often negative. One of my thoughts is that whether these characterizations of Zionism are accurate or fair, based on a little bit of knowledge or a lot, is probably irrelevant or is less important than what's contained in the statements associated with Zionism. The term seems to have become the stimulus object for a projective test. Now, I say seems because one of the contributions that Matt has made is to provide empirical evidence of what Jews actually think Zionism is about. And I'll talk more about his data and how I view it in a moment. But I'd like to give a little context. It actually comes out of some things I've been thinking about. I'm teaching a course right now to Brandeis undergraduate students about anti-Semitism, and I'd like to talk about the origins of the term Zionism and the origins on this side of the ocean in America in the early part of last century. And to play off of my association with Brandeis University, our namesake, Louis Dembitz Brandeis, who was the first Jewish Supreme Court Justice of the United States, was 1915. World War I was still going on, and he gave 2 speeches within the space of 2 weeks. One of them was a speech to a group of Reform rabbis, and it's titled "The Jewish Problem." And then 10 days or so later, he gave an address, B'Yom Ha'atzmaut Shel Artzot Habrit, our Independence Day here in the United States, on what he called Americanism. And it was really interesting. In his Jewish problem speech, he framed it in terms of what was the state of the Jews and what was happening vis-a-vis anti-Semitism. He said Jews are the most oppressed people in history. He said, and it's a puzzle because their values are the essential values of what a free and democratic society, a free and democratic society should be. And he said the values of Jews are the values of America. He said, essentially, we got there first with these values. America is a representation of them. And he declared that loyalty to America required Jews to be, and he used the word Zionists. He believed that Jews had an obligation in America to support fellow Jews, to live and populate Zion, if they wished. And it was clear when you read his other speech, his July 4th Independence Day speech, where he was speaking to a secular audience, and he did it in a symbolically important place, Faneuil Hall here in Boston. That in the American version of the speech, to be an American was not just to live here, was not just to own property, not just to identify as a citizen of the United States, but it was to express certain values. And that those values, he described, were values he was not explicit in the speech, but those values, judging from his other words, were the values of the Jewish people. He then made what I look at from the point of view of the 21st century as a really important sociological point. He said, America, if it is going to be the free and democratic country that our fundamental values say it should be, needs to preserve he called it the individuality of each of the immigrant groups who come to America. And there he was clearly talking about the Jews as one of the immigrant groups, that we needed to be able to preserve our culture, and that it was the mosaic of cultures that was going to make America the free and democratic country that he knew all of us wanted to be. And one of the things that I did recently is I looked at his words and I compared it to Megillat Atzmaut, the Declaration of Independence, the founding of the State of Israel. And almost word for word, many of the things in the foundational document for the state, that it will be based on freedom, justice, and peace as envisaged by our prophets, by the prophets of Israel, that it will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all of its inhabitants, irrespective of their religion, race, or sex. But at the same time, it should be open to Jewish immigration and the ingathering of the exiles. That those things, by principle, were not inconsistent. And so, for me, Zionism is still the ideal. It's still the ideal that Brandeis laid out. Still the ideal that, as I read Megillat Atzmaut, was part of the founding of the state. So what do, now to connect it to Matt's data, what do they teach us? Well, some of it I certainly know because I do these studies all the time. Jews are by and large very favorable to Israel. Maybe not 95% of Jews are highly emotionally attached to Israel, but an overwhelming group are. Most describe themselves today as Zionists, but not all. And I also recognize that this was not a perfect random sample, and so the actual point estimate may be a little bit off. What's really important about the study is the comparison between Zionists and anti-Zionists. That Zionists, and for those who describe themselves as such, the self-determination of Jews in the land of their heritage is the essential issue. And it does seem to me a little bit odd that the people who are anti-Zionists are distinguished because they don't believe that Jews have the right of self-determination, and then they take it to an extreme that it also involves the settler colonial oppression of the Palestinian people. What's curious for me is that, and supported not only by this work, but also other studies that we do, being a Zionist and being highly attached emotionally to Israel doesn't mean you are uncritical. People who are liberal tend to be critical patriots compared to people who are conservative. Most American Jews are liberals, and so criticism comes with the territory. As well, Matt didn't report explicitly on anti-Semitism, but it's interesting to link the current debate about what is anti-Semitism, where do you draw the line, and how do people view Zionism. And one of the things I've looked at closely over the last several months are the various definitions, including the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, what's called or classified as the progressive definition, because the progressive definition does say that criticism of the government is okay, that's not on its face anti-Semitic, but it also makes clear that to deny Jews the right to live in Israel and to enjoy their lives, to flourish and prosper there, that is in fact anti-Semitism. That is not part of what is acceptable. So where does this take me? What's for me the bottom line? And I think what Matt has done is reinforce what is a central Jewish value. Words do matter. I'm less concerned about the proportion of American Jews who call themselves X or Y, Z plus or Z negative, as I've put in my notes. Rather, what's important is what do we mean by the words that we use? What is our intent? What is our understanding of them? How do we use words in a way that allow the kind of debate that Matt talked about at the end of his presentation? It seems to me in this current polarized, politicized world in which we live, which is increasingly dangerous for Jews, no matter where we live, figuring out ways to use our words better, to discuss more productively with one another our differences, and actually to resolve them. That's the key issue, and I'm very appreciative for Matt for using his social science acumen to help us in that process. So, toda rabah.
Thank you very much, Len. Thank you for your comments. And now I will call upon Mijal Bitton, please, to share with us her thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Great to be here. Matt, great to be honoring you and your work. And I'll just say, I know that in your presentation, you wrote about journalists who call you up. It's also other colleagues and friends. And you embody, besides for your deep knowledge and careful research, a real scholarly generosity. So a lot of gratitude from, I know I'm not the only one who has benefited from your help, support, and wisdom. I actually want to begin by naming some of what I think you're asking us to do with this presentation, because I would say like the main body of the presentation has to do with data, but you framed it at the beginning and at the end with a certain call to action to our field and speaking both to researchers and to educators. And I would say that the main things that that I believe you're standing up for and asking us to consider is that at a time in which everything has become really politicized, social science is increasingly politicized, research that we do within the Jewish community has a lot of political implications, very hard to disentangle them. You're asking us to be responsible with the words that we use and with how we note different results correspond to actual data that comes out. To be curious, which means to not just assume or presume that we're all using the same words, meaning the same things, but to really try to understand the human experience. And I think you're also really asking us to be honest, that even if things don't conform to the way of the world we want it to look like, that we need to insist on being honest about empirical data anyways. So first of all, just thanking you for that, because I think it's really important for us to hear that. But Matt, the way that I want to respond is actually to offer a question to the beginning of your presentation, the framing that you offered, not the three things I just said, but a different aspect of your presentation that I think actually opens up some really big questions. Because the beginning of your presentation, before you speak about how you test the different... Can I ask that everybody just mute themselves if it's okay? Sorry, just to ask for that, it'll just be easier. Thank you. The beginning of your presentation, I believe, begins with a little bit of a critique, basically saying we have certain studies that say the following. So we can talk about like 95% holding favorable views of Israel, and they are being translated in public opinion pieces as either support for Israel or Zionism. Is that fair to say that's like a critique of that kind of jump? So it's almost a critique of saying we have certain forms of data and self-identification, and we're assigning them a meaning that is not actually exact and that is not actually precise. And if we actually examine what the category of Zionism, let's say, means, we would have a lot of subjective meanings out of this category and in terms of self-identification. So I think the main challenge that I want to put on the table is actually around this critique. That I think that part of the way that our ecosystem works in terms of gathering data and being responsible about it and assigning to it meaning does mean that we could interpret certain data in ways that don't necessarily take into account all of the different individual ways of meaning making around it. And to illustrate this, I actually want to almost bring this to other areas in which we do this. And I want to present them almost as counterexamples for us to ask ourselves, when do we feel comfortable assigning, right, new meanings to categories? And when do we actually try really hard to only speak in ways that reflect the infinite ways of self-identification? So I want to just bring a couple of examples. One example, and it's one that I've thought about a lot, and I think it's something that this field especially will be able to resonate with in terms of something that has occupied some of our conversations, could be, for example, the conversation around Jews of color. What do I mean by this? We have data in which individuals filled out in surveys their own self-identification in terms of their race and ethnicity. And this data was then by researchers taken and assigned to say, well, these are Jews of color, okay? Now, I can tell you a lot of things here. Number one, that if we actually do qualitative interviews and we test the categories, that a lot of people who were kind of assigned that would actually disagree with that assignation. And I would also say, even those who agree with it, they will disagree tremendously as to what that means. Right? Is this a political identity? Is this merely about marginalization? Is this merely about your positioning in the Jewish community? Is it about the American community? There's going to be a lot of different forms of self-identification that people give to what they mean by that. I can give you other examples. So I know for me right now, we're collecting data around Sephardic and Mizrahi self-identification in the United States. And I can tell you, for example, that you can have 10 different responses as to what someone means when they say they are Sephardic or when they say they are Mizrahi, and they're going to disagree very strongly with each other. I'll give you another example. Again, I'm just trying to provoke a little bit to take it out of the Zionism framework and to kind of pose a question. Other example, I remember when I had just begun my own ethnographic research of Syrian Jews, that I had one of my earliest interviews. I was speaking with a young woman, and somehow the subject of feminism came up. And she looks at me and she's like, oh, that's terrible. I hate feminism. I'm not a feminist. And I was like, okay, great. I mean, I didn't say great, but I was like, I was taking the information in. And I asked her, what do you mean by that you're not a feminist? She's like, oh, you know, I really like to dress nicely and be feminine and be a certain way and this and that. And I was like, oh, that is really interesting. So when you're saying you're not a feminist, this is not the way that I, or most people I would add here, are describing what it means to be a feminist. So the reason that I'm raising all this is that I think we need to ask some questions. And the questions are, is there a way for researchers and educators and community activists to actually be able to extrapolate from data and say, well, this kind of corresponds to the following positions? So I would say for me, Matt, I would feel fairly comfortable that saying favorable views of Israel in the current climate, for that to jump towards a minimalist meaning of Zionism, if I define Zionism, or to jump to like supporting Israel, to me, that doesn't feel so irresponsible in the way that we tend to have common sense meanings around certain data. So that's number one. So I think we need to ask a question, like how often, how much of a space do we have between certain, like someone that says, I go to synagogue, and then say they are affiliated. And you might say, oh no, but they didn't self-ID as affiliated. They self-ID as going to synagogue, right? So we can really ask a question about how much leeway there is between common sense consensus around what some things mean and the way they are assigned. So that's like almost like one question to put out there. Another question to put out there is, who gets to decide what is the meaning of these things? Is this up to researchers, right, within a community to say, well, we're going to give our definitions and then interpret things based on that? Should this reflect the actual people whose lived experiences we are trying to describe? Should we, in the case of Zionism, define it based on what people who aren't Zionists say Zionism is? Like, there's a real question there about epistemology and about who are the people that get to kind of think about what this means and what the implications are. I would say, Matt, by the way, that I thought it was, I found it interesting that you quoted people who didn't identify as Zionists as anti-Zionists. And I know you noted that, and you were conscious of it, and you were a responsible researcher. But we could totally open that up. Like, we could say there's plenty of people who don't identify as Zionists, who are either non-Zionists, or who are just, they don't like the word because they think it has a negative connotation right now. But honestly, like, they would identify with most of what most people identify with Zionism. So that itself is a move. And that's a move that I think is a legitimate move that you're making. And you're saying there's a reason why I am making this assumption and why I am making this jump. So at the end of the day, I think part of the question that I think is really important for us to ask is, how do we make sense? And this is a question that has to do not just with Zionism, but more generally, the tension between having categories that work for quantitative work, in which we need to come up with some sort of like definitions, some ways to talk across the board, some ways to gather data. How do we balance that between really trying to honor self-identification? And I took really seriously, like, the end of your presentation, asking us to think about what's a healthy discourse that takes into account shades, multiple shades of meaning. So how do we balance between those? And I also think, how do we balance, how do we have responsible conversations in environments where there's so many different stakeholders and where so many of these terms mean different things to different people? So I know that I learned so much from everything in this presentation. I probably, I didn't find anything, like, I think any either responsible social scientist or even educator, like everything that you said is important. There was nothing almost like explosive in a bad way about it. It's like, of course, people are making different meaning and we're using words in different ways. And I can say Zionist and mean one thing, and you might disagree with my Zionism, but we actually have the same views, but we're just using the words in different ways. As an aside, I often tell people that I also reject the God they don't believe in, because that is not, my God. So we can talk about that as well. So I think that can be part of our conversation. I think that part of what we have to do in our settings is actually come up with like working definitions, because otherwise, like en le davar sof, there's like no end to like the pursuing individual meaning making that we all have, and almost offer like we're going to have working definitions for Sephardic, we're going to have working definition for Jews of color. We're going to be honest and transparent into how we are assigning categories. We're going to be humble and about the inadequacies of our categories to be able to contain all individual meaning. But at the end of the day, we are like, for the sake of just the way that groups and societies work, and whether we like it or not, we are going to need to have some consensus over categories and use them in ways that kind of capture everybody. But that I think is the way to go forward. So that's my response, and I'm grateful again for the opportunity, and thank you, Judit and ASSJ, for putting this together, and Matt for the beautiful work that you presented to us.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mijal. Well, you can see, Matt, that when we planned about time allocation, etc., we thought of a much more reduced, but your presentation calls for lots of thought. I want to tell you that it came to my mind when we share a Bokser family name, written differently, but you're Bokser and I am Bokser, and you invited me to be your discussant when you approach the Rosenberg, you remember, at AJS, and I quoted then in the name of the rose, right, is the rose, and when Borges quoted, right, the golem. So here we have, I think, a twofold challenge that in your presentation comes first, the reflection about hermeneutics and meaning of our people that we research, and the other, our self-reflection, right? When we approach, why we choose to approach a population as Jews of color, knowing that we researchers understand also different scope and meanings. This is one first comment I want to say. Certainly on Zionism, it comes to my mind also, Matt, when the social psychologist of the Hebrew University, Hartman, differentiated following the development of situation in Israel between Zionism and pro-Israelism that was closely related after 67, right? And I want also to add, before I see we don't have in our chat questions, I also want to tell you that I much appreciate your understanding of how, and Len referred to that, when the transatlantic, right, took place, and Zionism arrived to the new continent, right, and to the Americas, and until today, there is a difference of appropriation of the idea, the concept, the organization, and how it becomes or not a focus of identification. I would invite you to think that next step, going not only north to Canada, but south also to the Americas in a wide perspective, will find the different meanings, right, of Zionism and one. So it's history and a comparative approach, but I think that we all enjoyed very much your presentation, and probably because we don't have any questions, at least until now, You would like to have the last word, Matt, or you prefer us to close today our session? As you say, please.
Sure, I'd be happy to. In particular, I think Mijal has given voice to many of my fears about this project. Anything I do, any decision I would make, was going to be viewed with approval by some number of people reviewing my work and with disapproval by others, whether that's scholarly or members of the community or advocates on either side of the conflict. And in trying to be as fair as I can to all parties, and keep the survey short enough so that I could get people to actually take it, I've probably made some decisions that that other people would disagree with, and I'm okay with that. I think I have to be okay with that. The nature of the game, when you do quantitative analysis, when you're studying 1,854 people as I am here, is I simply cannot get to the level of individual definitions that qualitative researchers might want me to get to. And I also can't simply dismiss the individual differences between the 1,854 individuals with their unique backgrounds, their unique stories, their unique understandings of the circumstances, as traditional quantitative research might insist. What I try to do is both, sort of balance the load, get the 30,000-foot view and the 3-foot view, and see if I can connect those two views to all the points in between, or as many as I can. It's painful, it's difficult, it's exhausting, and particularly for a subject like this. So I was originally scheduled to give a version of this talk on October 11th, and I hadn't had time to write it, so I'd set aside October 8th, 9th, and 10th to work on it. And for those of you who know me well, you know that I often use work as a distraction from things that are bothering me. It's one of the reasons I'm as productive as I am. There are a lot of things in the world that bother me. For, I think, only the second time in my life, I was not able to use work to distract myself. I was too upset. And part of that had to do with, I had friends, I had colleagues who were suffering, some who lost their lives or lost their children's lives. I have friends of friends in Gaza and in the West Bank who I knew were about to suffer. And whatever my views are, and I certainly identify as a Zionist, maybe not the same kind of Zionist as everyone else on this call, probably not the same kind of Zionist as not 95%, but a significant chunk of the American Jewish population. I want peace. I want my family. I want my friends. I want my chosen community to be able to live in peace, both in Israel and everywhere else around the world. And I knew that whatever happened as a result of the events of October 7th, we would not see peace for a long time. I still don't feel settled. Doing this work, which I'd started long before October 7th, in a way, it helped me focus a little bit on what I think and feel about the current conflict, what I think are some of the problems in certainly the American Jewish community, but I think it extends to other Jewish communities as well. And at the end of the day, if people have different calls that they want to make on who should be called a Zionist or an anti-Zionist and who shouldn't, and what is the right approach, what are the right opinions to hold, I'm comfortable with that. We're Jews, we like to argue. Disagreement is good, it's how we grow. But I want peace, and I really want other scholars and other, and educators and activists to be able to use what I've been producing here to figure out ways to have better dialogue, to have more civil conversations, both within the Jewish community and between the Jewish community and other communities. And one last thing I want to emphasize here. I was on a panel in November through the Israel Studies Center, the Nazarian Center for Israel Studies at UCLA. And the night before the panel, one of our scheduled panelists, Nazita Lajavardi, who's a political science professor at Michigan State University, had to cancel. And without getting into too many details, because they're not my details to share, certainly not in a public venue like this, the reasons why she had to cancel are probably what some of you are thinking. And that's depressing. It shouldn't be that way. Academics should be free to discuss any ideas we see fit. We should be free to have complicated discussions on complicated topics. And personally, I was really looking forward to hearing what Nazita had to say about a piece of research she just published with some colleagues in the journal Political Behavior about how essentially Islamophobia and anti-Semitism are used interchangeably by certain extreme right-wing actors on the internet to promote hatred of both Muslims and Jews. We, in this current circumstance, have a situation that is giving them plenty of fodder for their work. And that, to me, is it's depressing and it's scary. And I think it is a significant contributor to the violence in our discourse and the difficulty that Jews all over the US and Canada and Mexico and every other country in the world are having right now. We don't necessarily have anything to do with the current conflict between Israel and Hamas, but we're paying for it anyway because this is what's happening in the world around us. I hope that my research can help us do better. I hope that it can help us find tools to fight against these problems. And I am counting on all of you to do more than I can. So I think I have done what I can with this, at least once I get these various pieces into some kind of shape where I can publish them.
Well, thank you. I think that is, we would agree, moving. We are called as social scientists to explain, to understand, and not to reproduce, right, confrontations in the field. And probably I would say as a last comment, I don't know if we would agree on it or not, that objectivity has to do with, it is related, it is part of a conceptual and methodological requirement, which differs from neutrality. We are not neutral. We are, I don't see Deborah probably is here. We research the world with us in it. So there is a difference. We appreciate contributing with objective research and understanding. But we are sensitive and it's part of our world. I appreciate very much your contribution. I appreciate the comments of our discussants and the presence of all of you. And well, wish that we will meet very soon in another series of webinars. I want to remind to this young audience that is with us today, please join us. We invite you to be part of the association and please be attentive to the next call for grants, research grants. So this is what I want to tell you. Let us wish you, Matt, a successful continuation with this research and this a way of approaching a very difficult subject. Starting with what are the questions we pose to our population, right? And here we have a lot more to analyze in this very positive cognitive approach to research. Thank you to all of you, and we'll see you soon. Thank you. For you, really, Matt, you deserve a hearty applause.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I don't know, but we are going.